A death warrant was approved to end the life of Thomas Wentworth, Lord Deputy of Ireland. The signature on it belonged to King Charles I, who had once sworn upon his royal honor to protect his life. This document immediately stripped away his ruling power, confiscated his property, and sent the most powerful favorite in England to the executioner's axe. Wentworth's fall turned him into the throne's most perfect scapegoat. Daring to turn himself into an attack dog to protect the king, he absorbed all the people's hatred to keep the crown clean. That sacrifice was repaid with a bloody verdict. His story is a brutal warning about the cheap value of servants who blindly dedicate themselves to the royal family. In the 1620s, King Charles I believed he ruled by divine right and desired absolute power over England. He wanted to govern without parliament, modeling his reign after the monarchs of France and Spain. However, this ambition clashed with a stark reality. The English crown was entirely bankrupt. The state's financial ruin stemmed from a systemic failure that had been brewing for decades. England relied on an outdated tax system that failed to adjust for massive economic inflation. While the cost of running the government had quadrupled, the crown's tax revenues stayed completely flat. The treasury was further drained by corrupt court favorites and the Duke of Buckingham's expensive, disastrous foreign wars. Unlike European rulers, Charles could not legally impose new taxes without Parliament's explicit consent. The House of Commons knew it held the nation's purse strings and intended to use them. Filled with prosperous landowners and merchants, this group now possessed more wealth than the crown itself. They used their economic leverage to demand political reforms, while strict Puritan lawmakers fueled religious tensions by distrusting the king's Catholic wife. Parliament flatly refused to fund the government until their grievances were addressed. Refusing to compromise his divine authority, Charles rejected Parliament's demands for reform and the removal of his advisors. Lawmakers responded by blocking all new subsidies, creating a bitter stalemate that paralyzed the English government. Neither side was willing to concede any political ground. Into this fractured and explosive arena stepped Thomas Wentworth, a wealthy, educated, and fiercely independent nobleman from the north. Wentworth was born in 1593 into a powerful, deeply entrenched aristocratic family based at Wentworth Woodhouse in Yorkshire. The political culture of northern England was fundamentally different from that of London and the south. The north was isolated, rugged, and operated under a harsh, localized feudal hierarchy. Wealth was measured in vast tracts of land and the absolute obedience of tenant farmers. His education was designed to produce a remarkably effective administrator and legal operator. Wentworth attended St. John's College, Cambridge, and subsequently entered the Inner Temple in London, one of the prestigious Inns of Court. Here he received rigorous training in English common law, legal precedent, and jurisprudence. This legal background permanently shaped his political worldview. Wentworth was not a Democrat. He did not believe in the political enfranchisement of the common people, nor did he believe in parliamentary supremacy. He believed in order, hierarchy, the strict rule of law, and the sanctity of property rights. He viewed the state as a massive, complex machine that required rigid discipline and competent management to function efficiently. During his early career in the chaotic parliaments of 1614, 1621, and 1624, Wentworth built a formidable reputation. He did not align with the radical Puritans, but he frequently operated in opposition to royal overreach. He established himself as an exceptionally capable, articulate defender of traditional constitutional balance. He believed the king's authority was paramount, but that it must operate strictly within the established parameters of English common law. The defining moment of Wentworth's early career, and his most significant act of constitutional rebellion, occurred in 1626. King Charles I, having dissolved Parliament in frustration and facing immediate insolvency, resorted to an extra-legal financial mechanism to fund his government. The Crown bypassed the legislative process entirely and issued a demand for forced loans. This was an executive order targeting the wealthiest men in the country, demanding they provide the state with an exact sum of money based on their property assessments. The Crown promised repayment, but everyone understood it was a permanent tax masquerading as a loan. The enforcement of the forced loan was brutal. Individuals who refused to pay were subjected to intense state intimidation. Commoners were forcibly drafted into the military or had aggressive, unpaid soldiers billeted in their private homes. High-ranking gentlemen who refused were summoned before the Privy Council and imprisoned without trial. Thomas Wentworth, one of the wealthiest landowners in Yorkshire, analyzed the royal demand through the strict lens of common law. The forced loan lacked the statutory consent of Parliament. Therefore, it was an illegal seizure of private property. Wentworth flatly refused to pay. His defiance was not rooted in a desire to overthrow the king or establish a republic. It was a cold, calculated defense of legal precedent. He argued that if the Crown could seize property without legislative approval, the concept of private ownership in England would cease to exist. For his refusal to submit to the executive order, the state retaliated instantly. Wentworth was stripped of all his local administrative offices, including his position as Custos Rotolorum, Keeper of the Rolls for Yorkshire. He was arrested by royal agents and imprisoned in the Marshalsea prison, and later subjected to house arrest in Kent. He accepted the punishment with stoic discipline, leveraging his imprisonment to solidify his reputation as a martyr for the rule of law among the landholding classes. The Crown's extra-legal financial strategies ultimately failed to generate sufficient revenue to sustain the government. By 1628, a bankrupt King Charles I was forced to release the political prisoners and summon a new parliament. Thomas Wentworth returned to the House of Commons with immense political capital. He immediately positioned himself as the driving intellectual force behind a sweeping legislative response to the king's abuses. Wentworth collaborated with brilliant legal minds, including Sir Edward Coke, to draft one of the most critical constitutional documents in British history, the Petition of Right. The Petition of Right was not a declaration of war against the monarchy. It was a meticulously technical, precise legal boundary. It explicitly forbade the king from levying any taxes, loans, or benevolences without the formal consent of Parliament. It outlawed the arbitrary imprisonment of citizens without due process, habeas corpus. It strictly prohibited the forced billeting of soldiers in civilian homes and the use of martial law during peacetime. Wentworth's objective was to restore the traditional equilibrium of the English state. He leveraged his immense rhetorical skill and legal knowledge to navigate the document through both the radical factions of the Commons and the conservative factions of the House of Lords. Facing absolute financial ruin, King Charles I grudgingly signed the Petition of Right into law in June 1628. Wentworth had successfully employed the legislative apparatus to curb the absolute ambitions of the Crown. Following the passage of the Petition of Right, the political landscape underwent a rapid, violent transformation that forced Wentworth to completely re-evaluate his allegiances. In August 1628, the Duke of Buckingham, the king's deeply unpopular favorite and the primary architect of the disastrous foreign wars, was assassinated by a disgruntled army officer in Portsmouth. Wentworth observed the reaction of the House of Commons. Parliament did not use the death of the king's favorite as an opportunity to negotiate a moderate compromise with a grieving sovereign. Instead, the radical factions celebrated the murder openly. The Puritan lawyers escalated their demands, moving beyond taxation and attempting to dictate the religious doctrines of the Church of England and control the king's appointment of ministers. To Thomas Wentworth, this was a catastrophic breach of order. He analyzed the shifting dynamics of the Commons and saw a dangerous mutation. The legislative body, which he had previously employed to defend the law, was transforming into an aggressive, uncontrollable mob. The parliamentarians were no longer defending the traditional constitution. They were actively attempting to usurp the executive functions of the crown. Wentworth possessed no ideological loyalty to a squabbling factional parliament. He concluded that an empowered, radicalized legislative assembly would only strip the state of its administrative efficiency and lead England into total anarchy. The only mechanism capable of maintaining the stability, prosperity, and strict hierarchy of the realm was a strong, exceptionally competent, and absolute central authority. King Charles I, devastated by the loss of Buckingham, desperately needed a competent administrator to manage his fractured kingdom. Thomas Wentworth needed a powerful vehicle for his ambition and his unyielding vision of an orderly state. The interests of the sovereign and the Yorkshire constitutionalist perfectly aligned. Wentworth made a calculated, permanent pivot. He crossed the aisle, abandoning the parliamentary opposition to serve the executive. He became the king's most ruthless enforcer, preparing to build an administrative machine that would terrify the very men he had once led. In March 1629, King Charles I dissolved Parliament. Frustrated by the legislative blockade and the continuous demands for political concessions, the king resolved to govern the realms of England, Scotland, and Ireland entirely without parliamentary interference. This initiated a period known to historians as the Personal Rule, and to its detractors as the 11 Years' Tyranny. The king intended to manage the state exclusively through his executive cabinet, the Privy Council. However, Charles I was not a naturally gifted administrator. He possessed the theoretical desire for absolute control, but he lacked the operational stamina required to manage the daily logistics of a nation. To execute his vision of a self-sufficient, centralized monarchy, the king required an operative capable of translating royal theory into bureaucratic reality. Thomas Wentworth, newly elevated to the peerage as Viscount Wentworth, stepped directly into this executive vacuum. Wentworth recognized that the English state machinery was fundamentally broken. The traditional method of governance relied heavily on a decentralized network of unpaid local magistrates, known as justices of the peace. These magistrates were drawn exclusively from the regional gentry and the nobility. Consequently, they exploited their administrative positions to protect their own economic interests, shield their political allies from prosecution, and ignore royal edicts that threatened their localized power structures. To dismantle this corrupt, sluggish network, Wentworth forged a strategic alliance with William Laud, the Bishop of London and future Archbishop of Canterbury. Laud controlled the ecclesiastical apparatus, while Wentworth managed the secular administration. Together, they formulated a fiercely aggressive, uncompromising doctrine of governance that they communicated in their private correspondence under a single defining code word: thorough. Thorough was not merely a political slogan. It was a comprehensive framework for state efficiency. It demanded absolute, immediate compliance with royal directives, completely disregarding regional customs, historical exemptions, or the ancestral privileges of the nobility. Under this doctrine, the state would actively monitor and regulate the economic, social, and religious life of the kingdom. Corruption, previously tolerated as a standard cost of doing business, was reclassified as a direct assault on the concept of order. Wentworth intended to replace the decentralized feudal patronage system with a professional, centralized bureaucratic oversight accountable only to the crown. Before Wentworth could apply this doctrine to the entire kingdom, he required a testing ground. In December 1628, King Charles I appointed him as the Lord President of the Council of the North of England, encompassing Yorkshire and the surrounding counties, presented a formidable administrative challenge. Geographically isolated from London, the region bordered Scotland and retained a harsh, militaristic culture. Politically, the North was dominated by a syndicate of deeply entrenched, immensely wealthy aristocratic families, such as the Savills and the Bellaseases. These lords operated as localized sovereigns. They maintained large retinues of armed retainers, heavily influenced regional commerce, and treated royal laws originating from London as mere suggestions. Wentworth, a product of Yorkshire himself, understood the exact architecture of this regional power dynamic. He established his headquarters at the King's Manor in York and immediately initiated a systematic dismantling of the northern oligarchy. To break the power of the northern lords, Wentworth recognized that he could not rely on the standard English common law courts. Local juries were easily intimidated by the private armies of the nobility, and regional judges were frequently embedded in the patronage networks of the very men they were supposed to prosecute. Wentworth completely bypassed the traditional common law system. He weaponized the absolute prerogative courts of the crown, specifically utilizing the Council of the North's own judicial arm and the notoriously ruthless Court of Star Chamber in London. Operating strictly outside the established boundaries of standard common law, these formidable institutions employed no local juries. Instead, they were overseen directly by high-ranking royal ministers and specialized judges personally appointed by the king. Wentworth employed these institutions to prosecute powerful landowners who had previously considered themselves untouchable. He actively targeted the elite for enclosing public lands, an immensely profitable, illegal practice where lords fenced off common agricultural fields for private sheep farming, driving the peasantry into destitution. Wentworth ordered the immediate destruction of these enclosures and levied crushing fines against the perpetrators. The defining characteristic of Wentworth's administration in York was his strict, mechanical impartiality. He stripped away the traditional deferential treatment afforded to the aristocracy. He did not care if an offender was a common laborer, a wealthy merchant, or a high-ranking earl. If the king's law was violated, Wentworth executed the punishment with clinical precision. This impartiality was most starkly demonstrated in his confrontation with Sir David Foulis, a prominent Yorkshire landowner and a former member of the royal household. Foulis publicly criticized Wentworth's authority and actively encouraged the local gentry to resist the payment of royal duties. Under the previous patronage system, Foulis's connections at court would have shielded him from consequences. Wentworth did not negotiate. He dragged Foulis before the Court of Star Chamber, charged him with subverting the king's government, and secured a guilty verdict. Foulis was fined a staggering £8,000, stripped of his local offices, and permanently imprisoned in the Fleet prison. By utterly destroying a high-ranking member of the local elite over a matter of insubordination, Wentworth delivered a chilling, unambiguous message to the entire northern establishment. The era of aristocratic immunity was over. The authority of the state superseded bloodlines. Simultaneously, Wentworth transformed the North into an immensely profitable revenue stream for the bankrupt crown. Because King Charles could not legally levy parliamentary taxes, Wentworth maximized the extraction of non-parliamentary, historical feudal dues. He rigorously enforced the distraint of knighthood. This was an archaic, centuries-old statute requiring any man earning £40 a year from his land to present himself at the king's coronation to be knighted. Because no one had enforced this law for generations, thousands of eligible landowners had failed to attend Charles's coronation in 1625. Wentworth mobilized his bureaucracy to identify every single eligible landowner in the north and forced them to pay heavy compounding fines for their absence. The legality of the maneuver was technically sound, but the enforcement was universally viewed as a predatory exploitation of a legal loophole. Furthermore, Wentworth systematized the collection of recusancy fines. These were taxes levied against Catholics who refused to attend the mandatory Protestant services of the Church of England. Previously, local magistrates often ignored these fines to maintain social harmony with their Catholic neighbors. Wentworth deployed specialized commissioners to meticulously audit the Catholic population. He was remarkably indifferent to the religious theology of the Catholics. He viewed their existence purely as an untapped fiscal resource. He offered Catholic landowners a clear transaction, pay a fixed, regular composition fee directly to the Council of the North, and the state would guarantee their protection from further religious harassment. This ruthlessly efficient, pragmatic approach generated a massive, steady flow of capital directly into the royal treasury. Wentworth succeeded in his mandate. Within 4 years, he completely restored administrative order to the northern counties. He established a functional bureaucracy, suppressed localized corruption, and generated immense financial surpluses for King Charles I. The north of England operated as a strictly regulated, tightly controlled prototype of an absolute monarchy. However, this administrative triumph came at a severe long-term political cost. Wentworth permanently alienated the northern elite. The aristocratic families and the wealthy gentry despised him. They did not hate him because he was incompetent. They hated him because he treated them like ordinary, subordinate subjects of the state. He had systematically dismantled their localized monopolies on power and forced them to kneel before the machinery of the central government. King Charles I observed the transformation of Yorkshire with profound satisfaction. Wentworth had proven that the doctrine of Thorough was not merely a theoretical concept, but a remarkably effective operational reality. Recognizing Wentworth's unparalleled capacity for administrative extraction and localized subjugation, the king decided to deploy his enforcer to a far more dangerous theater. In 1632, Charles required a minister capable of managing a fractured, bankrupt territory that had consumed the wealth and military resources of the English crown for centuries. Thomas Wentworth was appointed Lord Deputy of Ireland, stepping into a political and demographic minefield that would test the absolute limits of his authoritarian doctrine. The geopolitical reality of Ireland in 1632 presented a devastating logistical crisis for the English crown. The island functioned as a massive, continuous fiscal sinkhole. For centuries, the English state had poured immense volumes of capital and military resources into Dublin, attempting to pacify the territory and establish a profitable administration. Every attempt had failed. Ireland consistently operated at a severe deficit, requiring heavy annual subsidies from the already bankrupt treasury in London just to maintain a baseline colonial presence. When Thomas Wentworth arrived in Dublin as the newly appointed Lord Deputy, he did not view Ireland as a lost cause. Through the strict lens of his authoritarian ideology, he viewed the island as a pristine laboratory. Isolated from the ancient common law traditions and the entrenched parliamentary pushback of England, Ireland provided Wentworth with the exact environment required to construct a working, unhindered model of an absolute monarchy. To assert total control, Wentworth first had to navigate a deeply unstable demographic landscape. The population of Ireland was rigidly divided into 3 distinct, fiercely antagonistic political factions, each competing for control over land and royal favor. First were the native Irish. They were the indigenous Gaelic population, fiercely Catholic, and largely dispossessed of their ancestral lands, following decades of failed rebellions and subsequent confiscations. They held virtually no political power within the Dublin administration, but constituted the vast majority of the population. Second were the Old English. These were the descendants of the original Anglo-Norman conquerors who had settled in Ireland during the Middle Ages. They possessed massive agricultural estates and considered themselves the traditional, rightful aristocracy of the island. However, they had remained steadfastly Catholic following the English Reformation. Consequently, the Protestant crown continuously marginalized them, viewing their religious allegiance to the Pope as a latent national security threat. Third were the New English. This demographic consisted of Protestant administrators, lawyers, and military officers who had arrived during the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras to manage the newly established plantation colonies. Though a minority, they currently held an iron grip on the Dublin government, the judiciary, and the established Church of Ireland. The New English operated an egregiously corrupt, localized oligarchy, exploiting their administrative positions to systematically strip land and wealth from the Catholic factions. Previous Lord Deputies had typically aligned themselves with the Protestant New English to maintain control. Wentworth discarded this strategy entirely. He viewed all three factions with equal clinical contempt. He intended to strip them of their factional independence and subordinate them directly to the crown. Wentworth's immediate objective was to eradicate the Irish deficit and generate a financial surplus for King Charles I. To achieve this, he required the Irish Parliament to vote for massive new taxation subsidies. The Irish Parliament of 1634 presented an explosive assembly. The Catholic Old English and the Protestant New English held roughly equal numbers in the House of Commons. Wentworth executed a masterclass in political manipulation, leveraging their mutual hatred to completely neutralize their legislative power. Before the session opened, Wentworth engineered a strictly divided agenda. He announced that the Parliament would operate in two distinct phases. The first session would be dedicated entirely to supply, the voting of financial subsidies for the king. The second session would address graces, a series of long-standing political and religious concessions that the Catholic landowners desperately wanted, including guarantees of land security and a relaxation of anti-Catholic penal laws. Wentworth approached the Catholic faction and heavily implied that if they voted in favor of the king's subsidies during the first session, the crown would grant the eagerly desired graces in the second. Desperate to secure their estates against the predatory New English, the Old English Catholics enthusiastically allied with Wentworth. They outvoted the Protestant faction and passed a staggering financial package, granting the crown 6 massive subsidies. Wentworth had successfully extracted the wealth of the island. When the second session convened to address the graces, Wentworth immediately executed a calculated political betrayal. Having already secured the funds, he possessed no intention of granting the Catholics the legal protections they sought. He manipulated the New English Protestant faction, who vehemently opposed any concessions to Catholics, to block the legislation. By playing the factions against each other, Wentworth ensured that neither group could gain the upper hand. He walked away with total financial extraction and surrendered absolutely no political concessions. He had successfully rendered the Irish Parliament a hollow, entirely compliant instrument of the executive. With the state treasury suddenly flush with capital, Wentworth initiated a comprehensive, ruthlessly systematic overhaul of the Irish economy. His objective was to maximize the island's revenue-generating capability while ensuring its economy remained entirely subservient to English interests. His first target was the maritime security of the Irish Sea. The waters surrounding the island were heavily infested with pirates operating out of North Africa and Spain, who routinely raided merchant vessels and coastal towns. This piracy severely crippled maritime commerce and reduced customs revenues. Wentworth deployed the newly funded Royal Naval Squadrons with strict orders to hunt down and eradicate the pirate fleets. The aggressive naval patrols cleared the shipping lanes within months. The volume of maritime trade moving through Irish ports immediately skyrocketed. Next, he dismantled the thoroughly corrupt customs farming system. Previously, the Crown had outsourced the collection of import and export taxes to private syndicates of New English merchants. These farmers paid the state a flat annual fee and kept the vast surplus for themselves, actively defrauding the government of thousands of pounds. Wentworth voided these contracts. He brought the customs apparatus directly under state control, installed highly disciplined bureaucratic auditors, and personally oversaw the ledgers. The state's customs revenue tripled within a few years. Simultaneously, Wentworth engineered a structural shift in Irish manufacturing. He strictly prohibited the expansion of the Irish woolen industry, viewing it as a dangerous competitor to the dominant English wool trade. To compensate, he heavily subsidized and mandated the creation of a massive linen industry. He imported expert flax growers from Holland and master weavers from France at his own expense. He established a state monopoly on linen production, generating an immensely profitable, non-competitive export market that directly enriched the crown. The doctrine of Thorough demanded that no individual, regardless of their wealth or colonial pedigree, operate above the authority of the state. Wentworth systematically targeted the powerful New English magnates who had treated Ireland as their private fiefdom. His most high-profile target was Richard Boyle, the first Earl of Cork. Boyle was a New English Protestant who had arrived in Ireland decades earlier with practically nothing and had violently engineered his way into becoming one of the wealthiest landowners in the British Isles. Boyle controlled vast tracts of Munster, maintained a massive private army, and heavily influenced the Dublin administration. He represented the exact type of autonomous, corrupt oligarchy that Wentworth intended to crush. Wentworth avoided the standard civil courts, where Boyle's influence could taint the verdict. He weaponized the ecclesiastical courts and the prerogative courts to dismantle the Earl. The most symbolic confrontation occurred over a monument in St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. Boyle had constructed a massive, exceptionally ostentatious family tomb directly adjacent to the high altar, a location traditionally reserved for the most sacred religious artifacts. Wentworth, operating in conjunction with Archbishop Laud's strict high church policies, declared the tomb a profane insult to the church and a blatant display of aristocratic arrogance. Wentworth deployed the royal prerogative to order the immediate dismantling of the tomb. When Boyle attempted to leverage his political connections in London to halt the demolition, Wentworth escalated the attack. He dragged Boyle before the Court of Castle Chamber, the Irish equivalent of the Star Chamber. He initiated a forensic audit of Boyle's land acquisitions, exposing decades of fraud and the illegal seizure of church properties. Wentworth humiliated the most powerful man in Ireland, forcing Boyle to publicly dismantle the tomb himself and fining him a staggering £15,000. The total subjugation of the Earl of Cork demonstrated that the new administration possessed the capability and the willingness to destroy the established colonial elite. Having broken the New English Protestants, Wentworth rotated his administrative artillery toward the Old English and the native Irish. He established the Commission for Defective Titles, a highly predatory legal instrument designed to strip land from Catholic owners and transfer it directly to the Crown. The Commission demanded that landowners produce original, flawless legal documentation proving their royal right to possess their estates. Given the chaotic, violent history of Ireland, very few families possessed immaculate, centuries-old parchment deeds. If a landowner could not produce the exact legal documentation, the state immediately seized the estate. The owner was then forced to purchase their own land back from the Crown at extortionate rates to secure a new, modernized title. Wentworth deployed this legal mechanism to launch the Plantation of Connacht. The western province of Connacht was one of the last major strongholds of Catholic land ownership. Wentworth intended to confiscate massive portions of this territory, evict the Catholic owners, and replace them with loyal Protestant settlers imported from England. When local juries of Catholic landowners in County Galway refused to find the verdicts required to hand the land over to the state, Wentworth abandoned all pretense of legal fairness. He arrested the jury members, dragged them to Dublin, fined them heavily for defying the Crown, and imprisoned them until they surrendered. He relied on sheer state intimidation to force the legal system to process the confiscations. The landholding classes recognized that their property rights were entirely non-existent under the Lord Deputy's regime. For the first time in recorded history, the Irish administration stopped draining money from the treasury in London. Under Wentworth's strictly centralized, aggressively extractive policies, Ireland generated a massive fiscal surplus. Wentworth channeled this surplus to execute a policy that fundamentally altered the balance of power within the British Isles. He built a superbly disciplined, well-equipped standing army of 8,000 men. He established severe military discipline. He ensured the soldiers were paid on time, fully supplied with modern weaponry, and continuously drilled. However, the demographic composition of this army created a geopolitical shockwave. While the officer corps was composed of loyal Protestants, the vast majority of the rank-and-file soldiers were Irish Catholics. In the deeply polarized, paranoid environment of the 17th century, the existence of a professional, Catholic standing army controlled by a royal absolutist was the ultimate nightmare scenario for the political establishment in London. By 1639, Thomas Wentworth had successfully executed his mandate. He had transformed a fractured, bankrupt territory into an immensely profitable, militarily powerful extension of the English crown. He had built a flawless, working model of absolute monarchy. In doing so, he achieved something structurally impossible. He completely unified the fractured demographics of the British Isles in a single, overarching hatred of his administration. The native Irish and the Old English despised him for the aggressive land confiscations, the financial extortion of the defective titles, and the continued religious suppression. The new English colonial elite hated him for dismantling their local monopolies, publicly humiliating their leaders, and terminating their corruption. Most dangerously, the powerful Puritan faction within the English Parliament looked across the Irish Sea with absolute terror. They observed a remarkably effective authoritarian dictator commanding an 8,000-strong Catholic army. The Puritans logically deduced that if King Charles I ever faced a severe political rebellion in London, Wentworth would immediately transport his Catholic military machine across the Channel to violently suppress the English Parliament and permanently establish an absolute Catholic-leaning tyranny. They gave the Lord Deputy a moniker that spread rapidly through the clandestine printing presses of London: Black Tom Tyrant, because the Treason Act strictly prohibited open criticism of the king under penalty of death. The English opposition funneled all their political venom, their financial frustration, and their religious paranoia directly onto the king's enforcer. Wentworth had designed a system that shielded the sovereign by absorbing all the friction of the state. He had succeeded in building the machinery of absolute power, completely unaware that a severe miscalculation by King Charles I in Scotland was about to trigger a chain reaction that would tear that machinery, and Wentworth himself, entirely to pieces. The tightly synchronized authoritarian system Thomas Wentworth constructed required total executive stability to function. In 1639, King Charles I fractured that stability by introducing a catastrophic, entirely unforced geopolitical crisis. Driven by his rigid belief in religious uniformity, the king attempted to force the English Book of Common Prayer onto the staunchly Presbyterian Church of Scotland. Charles executed this directive without consulting the Scottish Parliament or the Kirk. The Scottish population did not issue formal petitions. They immediately mobilized. They signed a national covenant, organized an exceptionally motivated militia, and marched directly to the English border. This conflict, designated as the Bishops' Wars, rapidly exposed the fatal vulnerability of the personal rule. King Charles I possessed the theoretical authority of an absolute monarch, but he lacked the liquid capital required to wage a war. His English militia was untrained, unsupplied, and deeply sympathetic to the Scottish cause. The Scottish Covenanting Army easily routed the Royalist forces and occupied the northern English counties of Northumberland and County Durham. Scots demanded a massive daily indemnity of £850 to halt their advance on York. Facing a hostile occupation and total fiscal collapse, King Charles was forced to abandon his 11-year experiment in absolute rule. He summoned the English Parliament to secure emergency funding. Simultaneously, he recognized that his current cabinet lacked the strategic capability to manage a multi-front crisis. He required his most effective, ruthless commander. The king elevated Wentworth to the peerage as the first Earl of Strafford and immediately recalled him from Dublin to London. Wentworth operated with a remarkably acute political calculus. He understood the exact demographic composition of the newly summoned Long Parliament. The House of Commons was dominated by the Puritan opposition, led by the brilliant, calculating lawyer John Pym. Wentworth knew that for the past decade, the opposition had focused all their ideological hatred regarding the king's extra-legal taxation and religious policies directly onto his administration. He was the architect of Thorough. He was the living embodiment of the tyranny they intended to dismantle, recognizing that his physical presence in London would provoke an immediate legislative attack. Wentworth requested permission to remain in Yorkshire to organize the northern defences, or to return to the security of his loyal 8,000-strong army in Ireland. King Charles I refused the request. He required his chief enforcer at the center of the government. To secure Wentworth's compliance, the king issued a formal, binding executive guarantee. Charles dispatched a personal letter to Wentworth containing an absolute vow. "I promise you, on the word of a king, you shall not suffer in life, honor, or fortune." Operating on the established protocol that a monarch's sacred oath was inviolable, Wentworth rode into London. On November 3, 1640, the Long Parliament convened. John Pym and the opposition leadership recognized that launching a direct legal assault against the king would immediately detonate a civil war for which the parliamentary forces were not yet militarily prepared. Their strategy was to isolate the monarch by systematically removing the operational pillars of his administration. Thomas Wentworth was the primary target. On November 11th, mere days after Wentworth took his seat in the House of Lords, Pym arrived with a formal charge of impeachment. The strategy relied on speed and procedural shock. By presenting the articles of impeachment directly to the Lords, Pym bypassed standard legal protocols. Wentworth was immediately stripped of his sword, arrested on the floor of the chamber, and transferred to the heavily guarded Tower of London. The king's most capable military and administrative asset was neutralized before he could organize a defense. The trial of the Earl of Strafford commenced on March 22, 1641, in Westminster Hall. The House of Commons acted as the prosecution, and the House of Lords acted as the judicial panel. Pym and the parliamentary lawyers presented 28 specific articles of impeachment. They accused Wentworth of establishing a tyrannical government in Ireland, illegally extracting wealth in Yorkshire, and, most critically, advising the king to deploy the Irish Catholic army to reduce England to a conquered province. The prosecution immediately encountered a massive, seemingly insurmountable constitutional obstacle. The charge was high treason. Under English common law, specifically the Treason Act of 1352, the legal definition of treason was extremely narrow and precise. It required an overt act of war against the sovereign, or a direct plot against the king's life. Wentworth's entire administrative career was a matter of public record, and it rested on one undeniable legal fact. Every single action he executed in York and Dublin, every fine he levied, and every regiment he raised was done with the explicit knowledge, written authorization, and signed warrant of King Charles I. He had not waged war against the king. He had functioned as the ultimate protector of the king's authority. It was legally impossible to convict a minister of treason against the crown when the crown had explicitly commanded the actions. To bypass the 1352 statute, Pym and the Commons engineered a novel, deeply controversial legal theory. Constructive treason. The prosecution argued that Wentworth's cumulative actions, subverting the fundamental laws of the land, imposing arbitrary government, and driving a wedge of distrust between the sovereign and his subjects, constituted a direct attack on the structural integrity of the English state. They posited that the state and the king were legally intertwined. Therefore, an attack on the fundamental laws was indirectly an attack on the king himself. They claimed that the sum of 28 administrative misdemeanors mathematically equated to a single massive act of high treason. Despite suffering from severe gout and dysentery contracted in the damp cells of the Tower, Wentworth delivered a forensic masterclass in legal defense. Standing alone without the aid of defense counsel, he systematically dismantled the prosecution's arguments over several weeks. He demanded physical evidence for the 28th article, the claim that he intended to use the Irish army against England. Pym produced notes taken by Sir Henry Vane during a Privy Council meeting, quoting Wentworth as saying, "You have an army in Ireland you may employ here to reduce this kingdom." Wentworth rapidly discredited the evidence, demonstrating that this kingdom referred to the rebellious Scotland, not England, and proving that the notes were uncorroborated hearsay from a single, politically motivated witness. Wentworth then addressed the House of Lords directly, focusing on the exceptionally dangerous precedent of constructive treason. He exposed the fundamental flaw in Pym's legal mathematics, delivering a crushing rhetorical argument. It is a hard measure that a man should be punished for a crime that was not a crime when he committed it. As 100 misdemeanors cannot make one felony, so 100 felonies cannot make one treason. The logic was unassailable. The peers in the House of Lords recognized that accepting the theory of constructive treason would destroy the foundations of English common law. If Wentworth could be executed based on a retroactive amalgamation of unpopular administrative decisions, no politician or nobleman in the kingdom would ever be safe from execution by a hostile faction. The Lords began to waver, signaling they would vote to acquit. The impeachment trial collapsed. Pym recognized that executing Thomas Wentworth in a fair court of law was legally impossible. Faced with the failure of the judicial process, Pym seamlessly shifted tactics. In mid-April, the House of Commons abandoned the impeachment trial entirely. They introduced a Bill of Attainder. A Bill of Attainder is an archaic, extreme legislative device. It removes a prosecution from the judicial system and places it entirely within the legislative branch. It is a simple act of Parliament that declares a specific individual guilty of a crime and prescribes the punishment, in this case, death by beheading. An attainder requires no trial, no presentation of evidence, no cross-examination of witnesses, and allows for no legal defense. It replaces the rigorous standards of common law with a simple political majority vote. It functions as state-sanctioned, legalized murder. The House of Commons, dominated by the Puritan opposition, passed the Bill of Attainder with a massive majority of 204 to 59. However, the bill still required the approval of the House of Lords, who remained deeply reluctant to participate in such a blatant subversion of judicial process. To force the Lords into compliance, Pym engineered a manufactured panic. He revealed the army plot, intelligence suggesting that hot-headed royalist army officers were conspiring to march on London, seize the Tower, and free Wentworth by military force. Pym weaponized this intelligence, deliberately throwing the capital into absolute chaos. Under the severe threat of political intimidation and the looming specter of an armed royalist coup, a severely depleted House of Lords narrowly passed the attainder. One final constitutional requirement remained. A Bill of Attainder is an act of Parliament, and no act becomes the law of the land without the royal assent. King Charles I had to physically sign the legal document that would send his most capable minister to the executioner's block, the exact outcome he had sworn on his royal honor to prevent. To force the king's signature, the parliamentary radicals deployed their ultimate weapon, the London mob. Throughout early May, the opposition leadership coordinated a massive demonstration of physical force. Tens of thousands of heavily armed citizens, merchants, and radicalized apprentices flooded the streets of London. The crowds, estimated by contemporary sources to be near 100,000 strong, surrounded the Palace of Whitehall. This was not a peaceful protest. It was a tightly organized siege designed to inflict maximum psychological terror upon the royal family. The mob carried placards demanding justice and screamed for the head of Black Tom Tyrant. They pressed against the gates of the palace, actively threatening to breach the perimeter, storm the royal apartments, and tear Queen Henrietta Maria to pieces if the king deployed his veto against the attainder. Inside the besieged palace, Charles I was paralyzed by indecision. His inner circle of advisors presented conflicting strategies. Bishop Juxon urged the king to maintain his honor and refused to sign an unjust death warrant, regardless of the physical threat. However, Archbishop Williams provided the king with an exceptionally convenient theological and political escape route. Williams presented the doctrine of the two consciences. He argued that a monarch inherently possesses a private conscience as a man and a public conscience as a sovereign ruler. Williams asserted that while Charles's private conscience knew Wentworth was innocent of treason, his public conscience required him to sacrifice a single life to prevent the entire kingdom from plunging into civil war and to protect his dynasty from immediate physical destruction by the mob. While the king agonized in Whitehall, Wentworth remained isolated in his cell at the Tower. He possessed comprehensive intelligence regarding the escalating situation in the capital. He could hear the roaring of the mob demanding his death. He analyzed the political geometry of the crisis and recognized that his continued existence was no longer an administrative issue. It was the primary catalyst threatening the survival of the monarchy, operating with absolute, unyielding loyalty to the concept of the sovereign state. Wentworth executed his final political maneuver. He drafted a letter directly to Charles I, officially releasing the king from his sworn promise of protection. Wentworth advised the king to pass the Bill of Attainder. He wrote that his life was a necessary, pragmatic sacrifice if it could heal the catastrophic breach between the crown and the parliament. He willingly offered himself as the designated scapegoat, absorbing the accumulated venom of 3 nations to shield the throne. On May 10, 1641, the psychological pressure broke the king's resolve. Charles I could not bring himself to physically hold the pen and sign the document, so he appointed a royal commission of lords to grant the royal assent on his behalf. The king chose executive survival over his sacred oath. He surrendered his ultimate protector to the opposition. When the Secretary of State arrived at the Tower the following morning to officially inform Wentworth that the king had authorized the attainder, the true tragedy of the architect's position was revealed. Despite having written the letter offering his life, Wentworth had fundamentally believed that Charles would find the political courage to defy the mob. He had believed the king would act like a king. Upon hearing confirmation of the betrayal, Wentworth did not shout, nor did he break down. He processed the absolute failure of the royal prerogative he had spent a decade building. He looked up at the ceiling of his stone cell and quoted a line from Psalm 146. "Put not your trust in princes, nor in the sons of men, for in them there is no salvation." The sentence was carried out on the morning of May 12, 1641. The gathering at Tower Hill was unprecedented in English history, with estimates of over 100,000 spectators packing the surrounding streets and rooftops to witness the destruction of the authoritarian machine. Wentworth did not require the physical support of the guards. He walked out of the fortress with a straight back and military precision. Upon reaching the wooden scaffold, he addressed the massive, hostile crowd. He did not issue an apology for the personal rule, nor did he confess to treason. He maintained his absolute innocence regarding the charges, declared his unwavering loyalty to the Church of England, and publicly forgave the men who had orchestrated his death. He removed his doublet, knelt, and placed his neck on the block. The heavy axe severed his head in a single strike. The crowd erupted into a deafening roar of triumph, lighting bonfires across the capital. The parliamentary opposition believed that the execution of Thomas Wentworth would permanently cure the political sickness of England and force the king into submission. The action achieved the exact opposite. By sacrificing Wentworth to the mob, Charles I committed a fatal strategic error. He proved to the radical factions that the crown could be successfully intimidated by organized violence. He demonstrated that his royal word and his guarantees of protection were entirely worthless, permanently alienating any capable ministers who might have rallied to his defense. Most devastatingly, he systematically removed the only operator in the kingdom who possessed the tactical brilliance, the administrative ruthlessness, and the sheer willpower required to successfully command a royalist war effort. Without Wentworth's iron grip managing the logistics, the royalist defense architecture crumbled. Less than a year after the axe fell at Tower Hill, the unresolved constitutional tensions exploded into the English Civil War. The nation was ripped apart in a devastating conflict that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The parliamentary forces, organized and driven by the very men who had employed the attainder against Wentworth, systematically dismantled the royal armies. In January 1649, King Charles I, utterly defeated and captured, was put on trial by a radicalized parliament. He was convicted of treason against his own people and sentenced to death. On a freezing Tuesday morning, Charles walked out onto a scaffold erected directly outside the banqueting house at Whitehall Palace, the exact building where he had hidden while the mob demanded Wentworth's head 8 years prior. In his final moments before placing his own head on the block, Charles I addressed the officials gathered around him. He did not express regret for his absolutist political theories or the initiation of the civil wars. His final, agonizing regret was his betrayal of his chief enforcer. He openly acknowledged that the unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence upon me. The execution of Thomas Wentworth, the 1st Earl of Strafford, exposes the inherent, fatal paradox of serving absolute power. He was an incredibly effective, highly disciplined administrator whose only crime was executing his mandate flawlessly. He employed the legal system as a weapon to crush opponents and extract wealth for the state, only to be destroyed when his enemies bypassed the law entirely. His demise remains a permanent demonstration of how easily judicial integrity is discarded when political necessity and physical fear take control of a government. He absorbed the hatred of a fractured kingdom to shield his sovereign, only to learn the coldest mechanical rule of statecraft. A ruler will always sacrifice his most valuable piece to keep the king on the board.